What if the most terrifying courtroom in the Middle Ages wasn't the one filled with judges, witnesses, and public trials, but the one where a woman stood alone, nameless, voiceless, and already condemned before she even spoke? What if the real machinery of medieval justice operated in shadows so deep that even jurists of the time whispered about them with unease? And what if the stories we think we know about medieval law barely scratch the surface of what those courts did to women judged, behind closed doors? Imagine a world where accusation meant isolation, where silence was taken as guilt, and where a woman's trembling breath inside a stone chamber carried more weight than any evidence ever written. These secret courts were not designed to reveal truth. They were engineered to produce obedience, fear, and the illusion of moral order. Every corridor, every torchlit wall, every whispered exchange between officials was part of a system that didn't simply judge women but dismantled them piece by piece, starting with their credibility, then their dignity, and finally their identity. Medieval society loved the appearance of order, but these courts thrived on ambiguity. A woman could be summoned at dusk and have her fate sealed before dawn, often by men who had never seen her face before that night. Their questions were crafted not to seek her story, but to break her will. Her words were recorded only when useful, twisted when needed, and dismissed when inconvenient. Even the jurists who witnessed these procedures described them as dark chambers, silent rooms, or places where truth entered disfigured and exited unrecognizable. They knew something was deeply wrong, yet the machinery continued because secrecy was its greatest shield. The fear these courts created was so powerful that women altered their behavior long before accusations ever reached them. A misplaced glance, a comment overheard, a rumor carried by a jealous neighbor, a complaint made by a man with influence. Any of these could pull a woman into a process she had no chance of surviving intact. The system relied on the idea that no one would ever see what truly happened inside those chambers. And because no one could witness the moment when a woman's voice was stripped from her, the courts could operate with impunity, crafting narratives that suited their needs while erasing the real one she tried desperately to defend. And yet, the most haunting part of these secret judgments wasn't the sentence delivered, but the atmosphere created before the verdict even formed. The long walk through narrow corridors, the cold echo of footsteps, the sensation of being observed by unseen eyes. This psychological descent was intentional. It prepared her to surrender before the questioning began. The chamber was a stage, and her fear was the script they relied on. For many women, the trial wasn't the moment of destruction. It was merely the final act of a process, designed to break them long before the verdict. If you've ever wondered how a system built on silence, fear, and secrecy could shape the fate of countless women, or how many stories were buried before they could even be spoken, stay with me here. Because what comes next has been hidden for centuries, preserved only in fragments of testimonies, marginal notes in legal codices, and the whispered doubts of the very jurists who realized too late what they had helped maintain. This is where the walls of medieval justice begin to reveal what was never meant to be seen, and understanding these shadows is the only way to grasp the truth buried beneath them. Before we move forward, tell me in the comments what struck you the most about this hidden world of medieval judgment, because understanding your reaction helps shape the next layers of this investigation. And make sure to like this video and check whether you're already subscribed, so you don't miss the unfolding of these revelations that were silenced for centuries as we continue deeper into what those courts tried so hard to conceal. The mechanisms behind those secret medieval courts were not improvised events carried out by a handful of officials. They were part of a structure that had been engineered over centuries, refined through legal codes, religious doctrines, and political motivations that fed into one another with frightening precision. To understand why women were judged in darkness, you have to understand the machinery that kept the system alive, a combination of authority, fear, and ritual that created the illusion of justice while erasing any chance for the accused to defend themselves. These courts operated under the premise that secrecy served moral purity, that silence protected the community, and that exposing certain accusations to public discourse would corrupt the very social order they claimed to preserve. But in reality, secrecy protected the judges far more than it protected the eye. Community. Even the architecture reflected this intention. Chambers were intentionally windowless, built beneath administrative buildings or monasteries, where the public could neither see nor hear what transpired. Notaries recorded proceedings selectively, often omitting the woman's words entirely or summarizing them in phrases that stripped away any humanity she attempted to express. The jurists who oversaw the trials often came from privileged circles, educated in canon law, schooled in rhetoric, and firmly aligned with the institutions that benefited from the silence of women. Their loyalty was never to truth. It was to stability, to hierarchy, to the maintenance of male authority in every sphere of life. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this machinery was the way ordinary people accepted it. The community often believed that women judged in secret surely had something to hide. Rumors were enough to justify arrests. Whispers carried weight equal to evidence. Once the machinery was set in motion, it rarely paused. These courts relied on a social ecosystem where suspicion became currency, where fear taught women to walk cautiously, speak softly, and avoid drawing any attention that might brand them as problematic or dangerous. And because trials occurred away from public scrutiny, everything inside the chamber became fluid, malleable, shaped according to the needs of those in power. The women brought into these courts often didn't understand the accusations in full. Charges were read in language they couldn't interpret, filtered through legal jargon that transformed minor disputes into offenses against moral or spiritual order. Some women belonged to families with political enemies. Others were widows with small properties coveted by local officials. Others were simply inconvenient, outspoken, or vulnerable enough to be ignored if they disappeared into the machinery. The secrecy didn't merely mask injustice, it made it possible. Inside these, courts, jurists used procedures designed to make guilt seem inevitable. They asked leading questions, withheld documents, cited rules the accused had never heard of, and interpreted silence as defiance. The very structure of the court was a trap, a circular system where whatever a woman said could be repurposed against her, and whatever she didn't say could be treated as implicit admission. The truth was irrelevant. What mattered was the court's authority, its ability to maintain the facade of infallibility. Understanding this machinery is crucial, because without it, the next stages of manipulation, psychological pressure, coerced confessions, and ritualized humiliation would never have functioned with such devastating efficiency. The courts did not begin in darkness. They were built on centuries of carefully orchestrated shadows that made secrecy feel natural, inevitable, even righteous. And the women who walked into those chambers had no idea how far the machinery extended beyond the walls they could see. The moment a woman crossed the threshold of those chambers, she stepped into a psychological landscape designed to strip away her resistance layer by layer. The officials who questioned her were not interrogators in the modern sense. They were craftsmen of doubt, trained to chip away at a woman's sense of reality until she began to question her own memory, her own intentions, even her own innocence. Medieval legal theory provided them with tools that blurred the line between investigation and manipulation. They justified coercive questioning by framing it as a spiritual necessity. If a woman was truly innocent, they claimed, she would withstand pressure without faltering. And if she faltered, that was taken as proof she had something to hide. In this twisted logic, the outcome was predetermined long before she opened her mouth. These methods relied on silence as much as speech, long pauses, deliberate stillness, and the weight of several men staring at her. From behind a bench created an atmosphere in which every breath felt like a mistake. Some officials spoke gently, using soft, measured tones that mimicked compassion, but carried the cold precision of a blade. Others used intimidation, raising their voices, leaning forward, creating the impression that time was running out and that she had only one chance to cooperate. Cooperation, of course, meant confirming the narrative they had already crafted. What made these tactics so effective was the isolation. Women entered the chamber alone, without advocates, without knowledge of the accusations beyond what the court chose to tell them. They had no understanding of their rights, no ability to request representation, and no guarantee that their words would be recorded truthfully. Their vulnerability was not incidental. It was the foundation of the entire process. When the officials wanted confession, they didn't need torture devices. They used logic twisted into knots. They presented contradictions in her past statements she had never made. They insisted that multiple witnesses had spoken against her, even when no such witnesses existed. They suggested that refusing to confess now would lead to harsher consequences later. Social disgrace, spiritual damnation, or even physical punishment administered under the guise of clarification. They framed confession as salvation, urging her to unburden herself, to speak the truth that aligned with their expectations. The psychological effect was profound. Many women, exhausted by hours of questioning, confused by legal jargon, and terrified of the unknown, began to doubt themselves. They wondered if a misplaced word, a misunderstood gesture, or a forgotten detail from years ago could be interpreted as guilt. The officials used fear as a sculpting tool, shaping silence into confession and confusion into compliance. Some courts went further, employing tactics today recognizable as early forms of psychological torture, sleep deprivation, disorientation, prolonged waiting, and the strategic use of humiliation. Women were sometimes forced to stand for hours, their legs trembling, while questions came in cycles designed to wear down their defenses. Others were confronted with fabricated evidence or ambiguous objects interpreted as signs of wrongdoing. The smallest hesitation could be taken as proof that she was hiding something. This machinery of confession didn't rely on physical force. Its power came from its ability to create an environment where truth dissolved into uncertainty, where fear replaced clarity, and where a woman's voice, already fragile within the broader social structure, became a tool used against her. The jurists who witnessed this process wrote cautiously about its effects, noting how often women yielded after prolonged questioning. They never admitted the yield was engineered. And by the time a woman signed her confession, if she could sign at all, the officials had already prepared the next phase of judgment, confident that the psychological architecture of the chamber had done its work well enough to justify whatever came next. The accusations that brought women into these hidden chambers often began not with direct claims but with whispered suggestions, subtle insinuations, or anonymous denunciations that carried disproportionate weight in medieval society. These courts thrived on ambiguity, embracing accusations that were intentionally vague, improper conduct, suspicious behavior, unverified rumors of moral failing. Because these claims were rarely specific, they allowed officials limitless interpretive freedom. A vague accusation could be bent into almost any shape, giving judges the authority to decide meaning, intent, and guilt based entirely on their own assumptions and biases. Anonymous denunciations were especially powerful. The identity of the accuser was often concealed from the woman, supposedly to protect the community from retaliation. But this secrecy robbed her of the chance to confront her accuser, expose motives, or provide context. A jealous neighbor, a resentful relative, or a man with personal grievances could trigger a process that spiraled far beyond the original complaint. And because no one outside the court witnessed the procedure, Accusations were transformed into evidence simply by being spoken within those walls. These denunciations also allowed authorities to manipulate outcomes strategically. When officials wanted to pursue a particular case, they could encourage anonymous accusations to justify intervention. When they wished to silence a woman whose voice disrupted local power dynamics, they could interpret even harmless behavior as grounds for suspicion. The ritual of accusation became a tool of governance, a way to reinforce social order by targeting those who stepped outside prescribed roles. Women accused through these indirect pathways found themselves trapped in a web they could neither see nor escape. They were often unaware of the charges until they arrived at the chamber, where judges read statements crafted by unknown hands. These statements used moralizing language, framing the accused as a threat to social harmony. Even when women protested, their objections were interpreted as hostility or defiance, further incriminating them. The secrecy of the process ensured that no one questioned its validity. The community received only the final verdict, never the methods used to reach it. Families often accepted the court's judgment, believing it reflected divine or legal authority. The woman's story disappeared beneath layers of silence, replaced by an official narrative she had no power to correct. This ritualized system of accusation created an environment where truth mattered less than the appearance of order. The courts operated with a confidence born of unchallenged authority, shaping destinies based on whispers, assumptions, and interpretations that served those in power. And because these proceedings remained hidden, the injustices they produced were rarely questioned. Women disappeared into these chambers not because of what they did, but because the system allowed their disappearance to go unexamined. Understanding these mechanisms reveals how deeply fear permeated medieval communities. It wasn't just fear of punishment, it was fear of accusation itself, fear of becoming the next name whispered into the darkness. And for women who already navigated society with limited protection, the threat was constant, shaping their daily behavior and reinforcing their vulnerability in ways the courts depended on to sustain their authority. If any part of this makes you reflect on how much power silence has in shaping history, share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective helps uncover how these forgotten stories still echo in the way we understand justice today. The punishments issued by these medieval courts were never meant merely to penalize wrongdoing. They were crafted to engineer obedience, shape behavior, and remind every woman watching from the shadows that silence was safer than truth. The judges who sat behind those heavy wooden benches understood that fear was the most efficient means of control. So instead of designing punishments proportionate to alleged offenses, they constructed sentences that communicated a message far beyond the accused herself. Each verdict acted like a stone thrown into a still pond, its ripples reaching families, neighbors, entire communities. The goal wasn't justice. It was deterrence. Some punishments were symbolic, hitting at the heart of what medieval society expected from women. A woman accused of impropriety could be forced to stand in the public square wearing a garment designed to humiliate her, marked as guilty before anyone even knew her story. Others were fined beyond what their families could afford, creating economic ruin that served as a long-term reminder of the court's authority. These financial punishments often led to debt servitude, binding women to powerful households where they had little chance of escaping further exploitation. But the more severe sentences reflected the darkest intentions of the system. Women could be banished from their villages, exiled to monasteries where they lived under strict surveillance, or handed over to local authorities who enforced punishments that blurred the line between discipline and physical coercion. Some punishments were disguised as moral correction, performed behind closed doors so that no record of the extent of suffering remained. What happened in those rooms was rarely documented, except for occasional notes by clerics who hinted at measures appropriate to restore order, phrasing that concealed far more than it revealed. Even more insidious was the way the system manipulated fear in advance of punishment. The very possibility of being judged by these courts altered how women moved through their lives. They spoke carefully, avoided conflicts, and submitted to social expectations, even when those expectations suffocated them. Mothers instructed daughters to stay unseen, to dress modestly, to avoid gathering with other women in ways that might draw suspicion. Fear became an inheritance, passed down from one generation to the next, shaping the behavior of women long before any accusation reached the ears of a judge. The courts also weaponized reputation. A punishment didn't end with a sentence. It lingered in the form of social stigma. A woman who emerged from a secret chamber was rarely seen the same way again. Neighbors whispered. Families distanced themselves. Her credibility vanished. Even if she survived the process, the court ensured she carried its imprint forever. In some cases, this social destruction was the true purpose of the trial, eliminating women who challenged authority or disrupted community expectations. The most chilling aspect of these punishments was their unpredictability. Because the courts operated in secrecy, no one truly knew what constituted a minor offense or a major one. What earned one woman a warning might earn another exile. The inconsistency kept society tense and compliant, unsure of what line could trigger the machinery. Judges maintained their power not through violence alone, but through ambiguity, allowing fear to do the work for them. And yet, beneath these layers of institutional control, there were moments, rare, fragile, and often undocumented, when jurists themselves hesitated. Some left marginal notes expressing discomfort with the severity of sentences. Others questioned whether community rumors were sufficient for formal judgment. But the machinery was larger than individual doubts. It demanded outcomes, and outcomes required sacrifices. Women became the fuel that kept the system functioning. These punishments, crafted to shape society through fear and obedience, were not simply responses to alleged crimes. They were instruments used to maintain a structure that depended on women staying silent, compliant, and invisible. And as these sentences echoed through villages and towns, they set the stage for something even darker. The cases where no possibility of defense existed at all, where women's fates were sealed by forces far beyond their control. The cases that unfolded in these chambers were often predetermined long before a woman ever stepped across the threshold. Her guilt was not something to be discovered, it was something to be confirmed. The court machinery operated on the quiet understanding that certain women, widows with property, wives caught between political disputes, servants who knew too much, daughters who resisted expected roles, were easier to condemn because their existence disrupted the fragile balance of power within the community. Once targeted, they entered a process that unfolded like a script, each step pushing them closer to a fate others had already decided. Records from the period, though sparse and often heavily filtered, reveal patterns that expose how deeply this predetermination ran. Witness testimonies were sometimes collected before formal accusations were even filed, suggesting that the narrative of wrongdoing was crafted first and presented to the accused only when the court deemed the moment most advantageous. In rare surviving notes, jurists described women as intractable, disruptive, or troublesome long before any evidence appeared, revealing that character assessments shaped outcomes more than facts ever did. The process relied on a kind of moral profiling. Once labeled as someone capable of wrongdoing, the court treated every word, gesture, or hesitation as confirmation of guilt. Many of these women had no opportunity to defend themselves because their stories contradicted what the court needed to maintain its authority. The officials who questioned them often dismissed. Explanations as evasiveness and attempts to provide context were interpreted as defiance. Some women tried to recount the truth behind the accusations: jealous neighbors, family conflicts, disputes over inheritance, but their voices never made it into the records. Instead, notaries summarized their words into vague phrases like, "She denies the charges," effectively erasing the complexity of their lives and the reality of their circumstances. And yet, within these rigid and unforgiving procedures, fragments of real cases have survived. Rare glimpses into the lives of women who were pulled into the machinery against their will. One account describes a young widow whose late husband's relatives coveted the small plot of land she had inherited. Anonymous accusations of improper behavior circulated, conveniently aligning with the interests of those seeking to displace her. Another record recounts a maidservant accused of disrupting domestic order, a phrase so broad it could encompass anything from speaking too boldly to knowing secrets her employers wished concealed. She entered the chamber with little understanding of what she had supposedly done, and her confusion was recorded by the court as suspicious reluctance. These cases reveal a profound truth. The fate of a woman inside these chambers depended less on her actions and more on the forces surrounding her. The court served as a tool for powerful individuals to reshape social dynamics in their favor. Women, who stood in the way, whether through inheritance rights, personal knowledge, or perceived disobedience, became targets for removal. Their trials were not about uncovering truth, but about legitimizing outcomes that had already been decided in private meetings, whispered alliances, or strategic calculations. As these women faced their accusers, often unseen, unnamed, and protected by the very secrecy that condemned them, they found themselves trapped in a process where every path led to the same conclusion. Even when their answers were coherent, respectful, or backed by logic, the judges interpreted them through a lens clouded by prejudice and predetermined suspicion. The ritual of questioning became a performance designed to extract compliance, not clarity. And when the final verdict arrived, it echoed the intentions formed long before the trial began. Some women were relocated, others punished, others silenced so thoroughly that their names disappeared from every subsequent record. These predetermined judgments, carried out under the guise of legal authority, reveal how deeply the machinery of secrecy shaped medieval society and how easily justice could be transformed into a weapon. But the system's power did not end with individual cases. It extended into the very structure of medieval law, enabling judges to bend procedures and interpretations as needed, solidifying a cycle where suspicion became truth and truth became irrelevant. And as we move deeper into this hidden world, the next stage reveals how the legal framework itself became a tool for erasing women's voices long before they ever reached the chamber. The deeper one looks into the machinery of these secret courts, the clearer it becomes that the law itself was not a neutral framework, but a pliable instrument shaped to justify the outcomes authorities already desired. Medieval statutes were filled with ambiguous language, phrases like dishonorable conduct, disturbance of moral harmony, or behavior unbecoming of a woman, each one vague enough to be interpreted in countless ways. Judges could stretch, bend, or narrow these definitions depending on the woman before them and the pressures surrounding the case. Where clarity should have served justice, ambiguity served power. Many jurists of the era wrote treatises attempting to define proper procedure, but their guidelines often contradicted one another, leaving judges with immense discretion. This flexibility allowed courts to decide when evidence was sufficient, when witness testimony mattered, and when silence carried more weight than speech. It also meant that women had no reliable expectations for how their cases would unfold. What counted as a defense one day might be dismissed as insolence the next. What earned one woman mercy could condemn another. This inconsistency wasn't accidental. It was foundational to the system's ability to maintain control. One of the most devastating manipulations of medieval law involved the concept of moral suspicion. A woman did not need to commit a crime, she only needed to appear capable of wrongdoing. Courts wielded this idea like a blade, slicing away the distinction between accusation and guilt. Even when no concrete evidence existed, judges argued that a woman's character alone justified intervention. Her social status, demeanor, or behavior could be interpreted as signs of hidden transgressions. A widow who managed her affairs too effectively could be seen as overly independent. A young woman who spoke confidently could be viewed as immodest. A servant who asked questions could be labeled defiant. These interpretations followed women into the chamber like invisible chains. Appeals were nearly impossible. Although some legal codes technically allowed them, the secrecy of the process meant that no one outside the courtroom knew what truly occurred. Notaries recorded only what judges permitted, and those records were often sealed or withheld from families. Even if a woman attempted to challenge her sentence, she lacked access to the documents needed to build a defense. The appeals process became a theoretical right, rarely granted and almost never successful. Judges had little incentive to overturn decisions that reinforced their authority, and communities rarely questioned verdicts delivered by men seen as guardians of moral order. This legal manipulation also served a broader social purpose. It reinforced a hierarchy in which women were expected to occupy roles defined by obedience and silence. By selectively interpreting the law, courts could suppress women who stepped outside those boundaries, whether intentionally or simply by circumstance. The law became a tool not just for punishment, but for maintaining the structure of medieval society. Women who challenged expectations through education, independence, or assertiveness risked becoming targets of a system designed to restore the balance through judgment and silence. Occasionally, jurists themselves expressed unease. Marginal notes in surviving manuscripts reveal hesitation, warnings about over-reliance on suspicion, or concerns about unfair procedures. But these doubts remained confined to personal writings, never influencing the broader system. The courts continued functioning as they always had, quietly, efficiently, and with devastating consequences for those caught in their path. These manipulations of the law ensured that once a woman entered the chamber, her voice became secondary to the narrative already forming around her. And as the machinery evolved, it grew even more adept at erasing not only her defenses but her presence in the historical record itself. Many cases ended without names, without details, without acknowledgement, disappearing into silence by design, leaving only faint traces of the injustices carried out behind stone walls. If any part of this resonates with you or sparks reflection on how legal systems can shape the stories we remember and the ones we never hear, leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Your insight helps uncover how these forgotten narratives still echo in the structures of justice we examine today. The machinery of secrecy did not operate in isolation. It was strengthened, legitimized, and protected by an intricate network of institutions that worked together, sometimes intentionally, sometimes through shared interests, to ensure that the voices of women judged in secret never reached the light. The courts themselves were only one part of this ecosystem. Behind them stood religious authorities who framed silence as virtue, political leaders who valued order above justice, and administrative structures that recorded only what served institutional interests. Together, they created a world where injustice did not need to hide. It needed only to be written in the right hand, in the right ink, and sealed by the right authority. Religious institutions played a particularly powerful role in sustaining the secrecy of these courts. Clerics often acted as advisors, interpreters of moral law, or direct participants in judgment. Their influence gave the proceedings a sacred aura, transforming legal decisions into acts framed as divine will. When a woman was condemned in silence, the community was told that the verdict aligned with spiritual truth, not worldly power. This religious framing discouraged questions, painting doubt itself as a threat to moral order. Even when clerics privately worried about the harshness or opacity of the process, the institution's need to protect its authority overshadowed individual concerns. silence became doctrine, and secrecy became virtue. Political authorities benefited as well. Local leaders used these courts to manage conflicts discreetly, addressing disputes that might destabilize their territories if handled publicly. A problematic inheritance case, a dispute between powerful families, an allegation that could tarnish reputations, all could be resolved quietly through judgments delivered behind closed doors. These secret verdicts prevented scandal, protected alliances, and reinforced the image of leaders who maintained peace through wise and measured action. For them, secrecy was not an ethical dilemma, it was a political tool. Women caught in the middle were collateral, their voices irrelevant compared to the stability their silence secured. Administrative officials contributed to the machinery in subtler, but equally powerful ways. Notaries decided what became part of the record and what vanished. Their decisions shaped history with every line they chose to write, or omit. Some proceedings were summarized in a handful of vague sentences, while others were sealed entirely, locked away in archives that only privileged individuals could access. This selective documentation ensured that the court's authority would never be questioned by future generations, because the written record presented a sanitized version of events. Women's testimony, if recorded at all, was often reduced to fragments, stripped of emotion, complexity, or context. The erasure was deliberate, woven into the very fabric of bureaucracy. Even ordinary citizens played a role, though few realized the extent of their participation. Communities were taught to trust the system, to believe that accusations brought into secret chambers were handled with wisdom and fairness. Public faith in the court's authority allowed it to operate without scrutiny. Families accepted outcomes they did not witness. Neighbors repeated official narratives, turning judgments into social truths. Over time, the system became self-sustaining. Secrecy produced trust, trust reinforced secrecy, and women remained trapped within both. Together, these forces created an environment in which the erasure of women's voices was not a flaw in the system. It was the system. The combined weight of religious authority, political pragmatism, bureaucratic control, and social acceptance made resistance nearly impossible. Even when women tried to protest, their efforts disappeared into a network designed to dissolve dissent before it reached a wider audience. Those who questioned the process were seen as threats to social harmony, aligning themselves, knowingly or not, with the accused. And in a world built on collective silence, few were willing to take that risk. This apparatus did more than suppress individual stories. It reshaped the memory of entire communities, ensuring that the shadows cast by these courts stretched across generations. And as those shadows deepened, the consequences extended far beyond isolated chambers, influencing how societies understood women, justice, and truth itself, shaping the fabric of medieval life in ways that still echo through the traces they left behind. The consequences of these secret judgments did not end with the women who stood inside those chambers. Their sentences radiated outward, altering the lives of their families, shifting alliances, and reshaping entire communities in ways that were often invisible yet deeply destructive. When a woman was condemned, whether through exile, humiliation, property seizure, or social shaming, the impact reverberated far beyond the walls of the court. The system ensured that the stigma clung not only to her, but to everyone connected to her, transforming the judgment into a tool for controlling families as well as individuals. For many families, the punishment of a single woman meant economic collapse. A widow stripped of her rights left children vulnerable to hunger. A mother labeled as morally corrupt placed daughters at a disadvantage in marriage negotiations. A servant condemned under vague accusations could trigger suspicion toward her entire household, creating tension and mistrust. These consequences were rarely accidental. They served the interests of those who wanted to reshape property lines, influence marriages, or weaken rival families. The courts, whether intentionally or not, reinforced social hierarchies by destabilizing those who stood outside the structures of established power. Communities internalized these dynamics quickly. People learned to distance themselves from anyone whose relative faced judgment, fearing that association alone might draw suspicion. Over time, this created pockets of silent suffering, families living at the edges of social life because the shadow of accusation followed them. Even when the punishment was private, the aftermath rarely was. Rumors spread, reputations unraveled, and once a household became stained by one woman's fate, the stain could persist for generations. Children grew up aware that their mother or grandmother had been judged in secret, a legacy that shaped their sense of identity and possibility. These outcomes reinforced the broader cultural message that women were responsible not only for their own behavior, but for the stability of their entire family. The fear of bringing disgrace became a constant undercurrent in daily life. Women monitored each other, subtly policing behavior to avoid suspicion. Mothers taught daughters to remain quiet, compliant, and careful, not because they believed these qualities were virtuous, but because they knew silence was a survival strategy. Even the slightest rumor, a raised voice, an unpopular friendship, a refusal to follow an expected role, could ignite the process that led to judgment. The pressure to conform became an invisible discipline, shaping communities more effectively than any public decree. In some cases, communities grew complicit in their own control. The constant threat of secret accusations created divisions among neighbors. People learned to observe one another with caution, interpreting harmless actions as signs of hidden transgressions. This atmosphere of mistrust benefited the authorities, who relied on community surveillance to identify potential targets. It prevented solidarity among women, who might otherwise have challenged the system. Instead, fear fragmented them, convincing each woman that protecting herself meant avoiding those who might be at risk. The long-term consequences of this system lingered in the social imagination. Over time, communities began to accept the idea that women's voices were unreliable, that their perspectives were secondary, and that judgments made in secret were inherently valid. These cultural beliefs became embedded in legal codes, religious teachings, and family traditions, surviving long after the specific courts themselves disappeared. The legacy of these judgments extended into later centuries, influencing how women were perceived, treated, and remembered. It shaped the narratives recorded by historians, who often relied on the sanitized versions of events preserved by notaries and clerics. This silence, carefully crafted, widely accepted, and deeply internalized, became a form of historical erasure. Women who endured these trials rarely left written accounts. Their stories lived only in fragments carried through oral memory, quickly overshadowed by the official records that reduced their lives to accusations and sentences. And as generations passed, the memory of what these courts truly did began to fade, replaced by myths of order, morality, and divine justice. Yet beneath those myths, the reality endured in the quiet ruins left behind, in the families fractured by invisible decisions, and in the cultural norms shaped by centuries of judgment carried out behind closed doors. As these stories faded into the background of medieval memory, the machinery that had shaped them continued influencing society long after the chambers fell silent. The silence surrounding these judgments created a foundation upon which generations built their understanding of justice, authority, and womanhood. Even as legal systems evolved and new forms of governance emerged, the residue of those hidden trials remained embedded within cultural expectations. Communities carried forward assumptions about women's credibility, their role in public life, and the perceived need to regulate their behavior. These beliefs became part of the invisible architecture that shaped daily interactions, determining who was heard, who was doubted, and whose testimony carried weight. The absence of women's voices in legal and historical records only deepened this cultural inheritance. When future generations looked back, they found little to contradict the narratives constructed by the very institutions that had silenced women in the first place. Notaries had documented the court's decisions with solemn authority. Clerics had wrapped those decisions in moral language. Political leaders had treated them as necessary for order. The communities, accustomed to silence, rarely questioned what they had been told. And so, the official story hardened into truth, while the lived experiences of countless women drifted into obscurity. Yet, history leaves traces, even when institutions try to erase them. Hidden between formal records are hints of lives disrupted, families fractured, and communities reshaped. Occasional letters, rare testimonies whispered to sympathetic clerics, and marginal notes written by uneasy jurists pull back the veil just enough for us to see what was meant to remain unseen. These fragments reveal a society where judgment was not merely a legal process, but a cultural ritual that maintained control through silence and intimidation. They show how deeply the mechanisms of secrecy infiltrated everyday life, creating habits of thought that lingered for centuries. Understanding this legacy requires more than reading official documents. It demands attention to what those documents omit. The absence itself becomes evidence, pointing to the stories that were deliberately excluded. When we trace these absences across time, patterns emerge, patterns of control, erasure, and manipulation that shaped not only the lives of medieval women, but the societies that followed. These patterns remind us that the consequences of secrecy do not end when the courts close their doors. They persist in the norms and assumptions that continue to influence how societies perceive authority, morality, and truth. Reflecting on this hidden history forces us to reconsider the foundations of justice. It invites us to question who has been allowed to speak, whose testimonies were dismissed, and whose silence was misinterpreted as guilt. It challenges the narratives that have long shaped our understanding of the past, revealing a more complex and unsettling reality. And in recognizing these shadows, we gain a clearer view of the ways historical power structures continue to echo into the present. If you arrived at this point, it means the weight of this forgotten world stayed with you, just as it has stayed with the generations shaped by its silence. And before we close this chapter, let me gently ask, if this journey through hidden medieval judgments resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel so you can continue exploring stories that rarely reach the surface, but reveal so much about the world we live in. Leave a comment using a phrase that marks your presence here, something like, "I saw through the silence, so I know you walked with me at Teofim." And if this exploration stirred something in you, a like helps show the value of bringing these forgotten histories to light. There is another video waiting that expands this conversation, one that connects the echoes of secrecy with the forces that shaped other parts of medieval life. Click on it and continue this path with me, wherever these shadows lead next.